Hello, I'm Scott Young, speaking with you from freezing cold New York City. And while I can't be there for the conference with you in person, I am really pleased to have been invited to make this small contribution to what I'm sure will be a terrific event. So, with that said, I will jump into sharing this presentation with you, and you'll see that the focus today is on applying behavioral science in business. And what I'd like to do is share three articles that I've been working on along with colleagues over the past year, all of which share a different perspective on the larger challenge of growing the impact and influence and ultimately positive impact of behavioral science in the business world. And as we jump in, I guess I should start with a bit of background on myself. I am very much a practitioner. My background is in consumer and shopper insights. I led an agency for many years. And then about 10 years ago, transitioned into applied behavioral science consulting at BVA Group, and then later at the Behavioral Insights team. And today, I do a combination of consulting and teaching and writing and speaking. And in all of them, really, what I try to do is serve as a bridge of sorts between the business world and the behavioral science world. So, on the one hand, really working to introduce behavioral science to business leaders and helping get them working and applying some of these principles in what they do. And on the other side, helping behavioral scientists, aspiring students, and others better understand the business world, some of the realities and challenges and opportunities that lie there. So, with that said, I think you'll see some of these themes emerge in the three articles that I'll speak about. The first, and the one that I'll spend the most time with, um, is called Bridging the Divide, kind of an awkward title here, Bridging the Divide Between the Potential and Practice of Behavioral Science in the Private Sector. And you'll see this certainly isn't my voice alone. In fact, I spoke with eight leaders across the world, all of whom are kind of facing similar challenges of applying behavioral science in a business context, whether it is an internal leader within an organization or as a consultant coming to organizations. And I'll start with our incoming premise, which I think is an important one. And I'll give you a second to read this. But essentially, what you'll see is I think there's a common feeling that private sector adoption has actually lagged behind what we see in the public sector, in the policy world, and so forth. And when you think about that, that's really an interesting dynamic because in most areas, the private sector, the businesses are often the leaders in innovation, new ideas, new technologies, et cetera. And then the public sector kind of lags a little bit behind for a variety of reasons. But here, a little bit of an inverse of that. And as you'll see, we really feel that this is a missed opportunity, right? If we believe in applied behavioral science and we believe in a lot of what we've learned about human behavior and decision making, we feel that it can have a positive impact. And, regardless of your thoughts about private sector, the reality is it impacts millions upon millions of employees and an even greater factor of customers. So, the more we can instill this both ethically and effectively, the more opportunity there is, I would argue, to make a positive influence in people's lives. So this leads to the obvious question of, why do we feel there's arguably been less adoption or less systematic progress in the business world than in others? And while there were a lot of themes expressed from different people, you'll see that we kind of crystallized around three fundamental ones, which I think are really important for people to be aware of as they, again, as they approach businesses and think about opportunities to apply behavioral science in that world. The first broadest one is the idea of kind of a lack of definition. And I think Merle put it very well, as you see in this quote, which is we're kind of everywhere, but arguably nowhere. Other fields within the business world, marketing, human resources, etc., there's a reasonably well-defined idea of what the role is. But in behavioral science, that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, I'd argue that a lot of business leaders have a very limited and perhaps misleading perception of the field based on a few clips, right? Something that they've read or that they've seen, a podcast, a book, etc. And they latch onto one very narrow idea of the field. So again, lack of definition. Everybody can nod their head, behavioral science sounds great, but they don't really know what that means, and importantly, how that can help them. A second headwind of sorts and big challenge is the idea of an implied threat. And here you see the quote from Tim Houlihan that, we have to realize folks need to know enough about behavioral science, but importantly, they also need to some degree to kind of admit that what they've been doing has limitations or has gone wrong. And that's a lot to assume from people, right? Any new idea, not just behavioral science, but any new idea coming in can come across as a threat to those in power or those making decisions already. And I think we have to be extremely aware of that when we start to come in as outsiders to organizations presenting behavioral science. And a third idea, maybe one that might be less immediately evident, but I think James Healy makes a really good point here, is the idea of resistance to experimentation. When we think about how we often talk about behavioral science, we talk about the idea that, what the principles and the learning and the frameworks and ultimately the interventions give us are a set of hypotheses, but we don't always know that they're going to work. And in fact, often what we do find is maybe unintended consequences, or some things don't work as we had anticipated they might in a new context. And that's a hard sell for businesses, and for business leaders. Often they're looking for what they believe to be tried and true. And the idea that, hey, we're going to come up with new ideas, we're going to test them, experiment with them. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Again, that's an uphill climb in many cases. So, again, three larger ideas, all of which we have to be aware of and think about in presenting behavioral science to business leaders. And a fourth one, which I think is interesting, expressed by my former colleague and my good friend Ted Utoff, is that sometimes I think we fall into a trap of our own making, in the sense that, what gets headlines and gets excitement and interest is often a great story about a very low cost intervention that had a huge impact. And we all know some of these different stories out there, but that can lead to the expectation of a silver bullet and that we're just going to come up with cute little nudges that will have a disproportionate impact. And then later, when we try to make an argument that, this is a discipline, it's a science, we need rigor, etc., that doesn't fly very far. So again, we need to think about how we're presenting the field in multiple levels. So where do we go next? Well, obviously, it's the idea of, what can we do to overcome some of these barriers? And arguably, there's no single easy answer to this. If there was, I think we'd be much further along in the private sector than we are today. However, I do think there are a few obvious approaches that I certainly feel are important and that came across from these folks that I spoke with. The first, and speaking to that challenge of lack of definition, is indeed speaking and working more consistently and clearly in defining the what and the why behind behavioral science, particularly in this business context. And I think this first sentence, understanding how people behave in practice, in the real world, and using that knowledge to design better products, services, processes, policies, is a really good starting point. And I should mention this comes courtesy of Behavioral Insights team. So again, speaking consistently about both the premise and the why, I think are incredibly important, in not only defining the field a little bit more broadly, but also starting to bring it to an area where business leaders view it as something not abstract, but as something that could actually help them. Going a next level, again, I think there's an importance in framing or presenting the field to business leaders. And this is, I think, a, an analogy or that many of you may have seen. I think is a good as good as one as any, which is this idea of a lens. The parallel that I often think of or draw from is kind of the idea of the law, right? If people have gone through legal education, it certainly gives them a set of knowledge, but it really gives them a way of looking at the world. And I think behavioral science does that in a parallel way for many of us. It gives us a new way of looking, grounded a little bit more broadly in the way people think and they make decisions, emphasizing behavior, which is extremely important, and again, committed to this idea of experimentation and measurement. And I think Dilip Soman from Rotman put it very well, where he talks about behavior as a lens and science as the method, bringing those two ideas together. So again, consistent kind of definition or starting point. What is this and why? And what does it give us or bring others? And then, finally, I wanted to share a few other, kind of at another level, a few other things that I find are really important in presenting behavioral science to business colleagues, business leaders. One of the most important points I'd make is the idea of expressing this not as something additional that they need to learn and they need to worry about and perhaps think of as a new problem and a new challenge when they already feel busy, but something that can help them address what they're already worried about. A lens, an approach, a set of tools to think about the things that are already keeping them up at night, so to speak. Second important point, and this kind of speaks to the idea that we mentioned before about kind of an implied challenge or threat, is the idea of behavioral science as a complement. We're not coming in telling them everything they've been doing is wrong, because that doesn't usually get us very far. Instead, we're saying this is an additional dimension. It's a new way or an incremental way of thinking that can work with some of the policies and ideas you've already got in place. Again, no one wants to hear that everything they've been doing is wrong and it needs to be replaced. What they want to hear is you've got something additional that can help me. And then importantly, and maybe obviously, yes, we do need to emphasize that often some of the interventions and solutions that we come up with might not require an enormous investment, and they do have sometimes have the opportunity to have a high potential impact. Now, to Ted Uthoff's point before, sometimes this can be a bit of a trap, but I do think this is also what's very compelling. And as long as we're highlighting a range of interventions and ways to make an impact, I think this is an important point to complement. And that kind of speaks to this last point that, a lot of business leaders have nudging in their head. Maybe they have one example of it in their mind. And I think very important thing to emphasize when we're showing examples and we're presenting the field is just the range of ways that behavioral science can make a difference. It's not just about one little reminder. It can have an implication in the rules and the incentive structures we put in place, the processes for hiring people and promoting them, et cetera, for example. And of course, in communication. So whenever I share a range of examples or cases, I try to provide examples from some of these different areas because I think it's important that they see the range of potential ways of making a difference. So I've really spoken the last few minutes about how do we define the field, how do we present it in a way that may be more palatable or more compelling to business leaders. I think another side of that same coin is focusing on use cases. And here you see this quote from Zara Khan, who leads behavioral science at Edward Jones and is also a colleague of mine at a nonprofit called Bessie. And again, his comment is a lot of behavioral science folks kind of think about the world from this behavioral opportunity lens. But really, if we're going into the business world, what we want to do is start with these large business challenges and business opportunities and then work backwards, because we're almost always going to find that it leads us to human behavior um, and an opportunity. I've given a lot of thought and also had been fortunate to work in a variety of areas. And um, I share these three, not as an exhaustive list, but maybe as a starting point in terms of areas where I feel that behavioral science can, and in some cases already has, made a huge impact. And I won't go through them all in the interest of time, but what I think is more interesting is just to ask ourselves, what are some of the commonalities across some of these areas, like, compliance, cybersecurity, consumer protection, or anti-fraud efforts, and a lot of people-related issues. And to me, they share a few common qualities, which are the ones that I would be looking for, as you look to see where can we apply behavioral science successfully in an organization. First and foremost, these are not new problems, right? These are not bringing business leaders another problem to worry about. These are areas they're already worried about spending a great deal upon. And as you look to the bottom of the page, I think that's a really important point. These are areas that we can come to them and say, hey, you're already spending a fortune trying to get your teams to follow the cybersecurity procedures and minimize human risk. Let's do it more effectively and more efficiently by applying some behavioral science insights and learnings and principles. Secondly, and importantly, these are areas with intent to action gaps. The vast majority of people want to do the right thing. They're not looking to defraud their companies. They're not looking to put their companies at risk. Um, they're, in most cases would like to be engaged at work and so forth. So, again, it's not a question of coercing. It's a question of helping people do the things that they would, in most cases, like to be doing. And again, the third point may be an obvious one, but one where we've seen, changes in process, changes in communication can indeed make a big difference. And a fourth point, an important one, and I know this could be a presentation in itself, I think there are areas we can all feel quite good about from an ethical standpoint. Um, and, I think I don't claim to have a perfect formula here, but I think a good starting point is to at least ask ourselves a few key questions. And a framework that I think about is this idea of a win-win-win. First and foremost, does the potential project represent a win for the organization? Because if it doesn't, it's frankly quite unlikely that they're going to fund it and be behind it. So I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't see this. Secondly, and extremely importantly from an ethical standpoint, is the behavioral change that we're looking at a win for those impacted? And as I mentioned before, I feel like if we are focusing on areas with intent to action gaps, you know, compliance, cybersecurity protocols, health and wellness at work. Again, I can feel pretty confident that these are areas where we're not persuading or coercing, we're helping people do the things that they want to do. And then that third level, ideally, we'd like to be pursuing things that are a win for society as well. And I know people can define that somewhat differently, but I do think there's some common areas that most people would feel quite good about. So again, when we talk about defining through the lens of priority use cases, I think there are some areas or some things to look for, and again, this underlying ethical component as well. And then the last piece in this article, which I'll just briefly mention, is it raises some questions, around what does success in the private sector even look like? I've kind of came in with the incoming premise that we're not where we'd like to be and that there's much greater opportunity out there and that it's a missed opportunity to some degree that we're not doing more. Um, we also look a little bit ahead and say, well, in order to make further progress, are we going to have to compromise ethically? And again, speaking to my last point, are we as behavioral scientists going to have to sacrifice control and be a little more comfortable with the idea that marketers or business leaders are going to run with some ideas, maybe in ways that are a little uncomfortable for us, or maybe with a little less rigor than we would like them to. And then ultimately, and I think this is a larger, kind of more existential question for the field, is the end goal, to build behavioral science units and teams and emphasize the field? Or is it actually more of the opposite, to become invisible, so to speak? And what I mean by that, I think, is well expressed by the founder of B-Way, where he speaks about the idea that ultimately what we want to do is blend. We want to become the way people do their work. If they're a UX researcher, they're a behaviorally informed UX researcher, and so on and so forth. And I'll kind of come back to this theme a little bit later. So that kind of summarizes that first article, which again is the one I'll spend the most time with. But I did want to share two other articles that I hope some of you will find interesting. Um, the second one is called Building and Sustaining Behavioral Science Within Organizations. And the root behind this was, you know, given some of the challenges that I mentioned and alluded to, I know it's difficult for behavioral science units to thrive long term over within organizations. With it, for every success story, there are many cases where units have started and then been folded up after a few years for a variety of reasons. So one thing I wanted to do is speak with some of the leaders who have driven sustained success and hear what they had to say and what advice they would give to others. And the first one I spoke with is Will Mailer, who you see pictured here, who's had a remarkably successful time leading the behavioral science function at Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And, essentially sat down with Will and asked him, what do you think has helped you be successful and help the team, establish itself and ultimately grow its influence within the organization and hopefully maybe more broadly with society at large. And I won't go one by one through these principles just in the interests of time. But what I would like to do is kind of share a few thoughts about their, kind of what they add up to. And, what really struck me is they all kind of point to this larger objective of really becoming a valued partner to business leaders. And you can see in some of the specifics, starting with their business challenges, a point that I mentioned before, offering a portfolio of services, giving them a variety of ways to work with the team that maybe calibrate or with different challenges and different levels of investment and risk. Reducing barriers to adoption, which often are not about financials. They're often about time and energy and effort and so forth from a team. So again, what really struck me from Will, and I think comes across in this article, is, it's about serving and being a partner. And you'll see at the bottom of this page, there's some specific elements around that, focusing on their objectives, but also using some of the language and metrics. So not imposing behavioral science on them as much as adopting the behavioral science to the metrics and the processes that are already in place. Um, and really, the takeaway at the end of the day from this article, at least, was the idea that, if we really want to grow the function and the influence of the function, it's not necessarily by screaming behavioral science at people and making the science the headline. It's really about, to some degree, sublimating it and positioning it effectively as a way to help these other business leaders be successful. And that can be a challenge, right? If we have gone through education as behavioral scientists, we pride ourselves on this knowledge. Maybe we've been taught to do it a certain way. Going in and really adopting that to an environment and prioritizing the things that are important to your partners can be a challenge, but I think it's something that Will has done successfully with his team and something that we can all learn from and adopt on some level. Finally, the third article I want to share kind of looks at things from a different angle. So if Will and the Commonwealth Bank team talk about kind of growing behavioral science by strengthening and maintaining a business unit, this looks at it from a different angle, which is kind of closer to that idea I mentioned about becoming invisible. And that's the idea of developing business leaders or executives who have the knowledge of behavioral science and ultimately making it part of their mindset and their work. And I think the first question we started with here was, well, what do we actually even want these folks to know about behavioral science? Can we really think about that, right? Because what we know is, it's not realistic. It's probably not desirable to have, the head of human resources or the head of marketing or insights or operations become a behavioral scientist. But what we do want is for them to have a working understanding and appreciation for the field and to bring at least some level of that behavioral lens that I spoke about before. But what does that really mean? Well, what we tried to do is really spend some time, and this was not just myself, but two co-authors, and saying, what is it we actually want out of these business leaders? And I think first and foremost is this idea of identifying the right opportunities, some of the opportunities that maybe fit some of the criteria that I mentioned before, um, you know, longstanding problems and challenges and opportunities where they're already spending or they're already struggling, opportunities that are um, intent to action gaps, and so forth. Um, and then kind of going a little bit further, can we help them think about situations or challenges in terms of behavior changes? What specifically do we want? Who do we want to do things differently when and how? And can we get more specific on that rather than kind of staying at this 30,000-foot view and talking about, collaboration, but not getting down to specific behavior changes that will add up to that. Um, and then, importantly, when we think of if we go down to number four, how can we educate them on what they can do on their own versus what and when and how to work with specialized folks, behavioral scientists, who do indeed bring a deeper knowledge, and how can we kind of lay the groundwork for that working relationship where we're giving them the knowledge, giving them the latitude, but yet they also know when they need us, so to speak. And we started to think at the next level of, well, how do we make this happen? If we're able to define some of these skills or capabilities, what's ultimately going to get us there? And again, I think this is a work in progress in the sense that there's no one answer to it. But a few themes that emerged that I think are areas that we need perhaps as a field to explore further. First and foremost, the idea that we can't just be satisfied walking in, giving, 45-minute presentations on system one, system two thinking and heuristics and so forth, and dazzling them with a few case studies, and then assuming things are actually going to change and that people are going to, and leaders are going to embed this in their lives. We really need to think about training on multiple levels, moving from that first level to a level that's very, very focused on application of frameworks, principles. What does it mean for them in their world, whether that's, again, human resources, compliance, etc. And then finally, hopefully developing, really trained behavioral scientists who are out there within business functions, serving as liaisons, leads, who can both educate others within a team, but can also come back to maybe a central behavioral science unit with the right opportunities and the right situations for them to work together. So, people maybe a general level of knowledge at one level, but then also folks that have a deeper level of knowledge, but yet are embedded. Second main theme um, is the idea of a coaching model. In other words, people aren't going to adopt this, it's not going to stick unless they're actively working on projects and importantly, getting at least some level of ongoing support. So we can't think of training as an end in itself. What we really need to do is think of it as a starting point and then ultimately help coach these leaders or their teams as they move through because that's really what's going to ultimately get them to a point where they're comfortable and it starts to become part of the way they think. And then finally, and maybe more broadly, um, I think we really need to think a little bit more about how we can better integrate behavioral science within core business education, whether that's coming at the master's or MBA level, or perhaps through executive education. I think right now what we have is a lot of sporadic efforts through individual professors, whether they're marketing professors or operations professors or finance professors doing this within their own courses, but it's not really happening arguably at a systematic level. And I think that's really an area that we need to think about as a field if we want to make this ultimately reach this goal of having a lot more behaviorally informed executives out there. So I hope these three articles were interesting to you, maybe thought-provoking to you. I'll just end with a few final thoughts, particularly focused at those entering the field. I assume there are a good number of you at this event and hope perhaps be listening today. And I've been asked this question in a variety of forms from people in behavioral science master's programs to young people who become enthusiastic about the field and like to make something happen in their own careers. And I put together an article um, just to try to systematize it and share some of my main thoughts. And you'll see three of the main themes that I really like to emphasize. The first, um, it's a natural human tendency, particularly if you've invested in education, to then go out and try to find a role that has that title behavioral in it, or to get a job in a behavioral science consultancy. And that's all well and good, but it's a very small universe of opportunity. Um, and I'd like to also encourage folks to think more broadly and think about that much wider world of quote mainstream jobs, whether they're in marketing or insights or operations and so forth, where behavioral science can be a point of difference. It can be the way not only you distinguish yourselves and get a role, but also why you do that role differently and I'd argue more effectively than another person or the person that's already in it. So again, there's just so many opportunities where behavioral science can really help you stand out and do the job better. Secondly, in this theme, I hope has come across throughout this presentation. It's tempting to lead with your favorite heuristic or favorite point and dazzle folks in that way. But most people, those who are not behavioral scientists in training, they're thinking about their own problems, their own challenges, their own opportunities. So, understanding, taking the time to listen and understand and start there and work backwards and quickly show somebody why what you're talking about can help them with their goals is really invaluable. And then finally, as I kind of alluded to, coming in, particularly if you've had an education in behavioral science, it can be very tempting to, come in and try to tell people the right way to do things. And of course, that's important, but I think it also needs to be balanced with flexibility. Um, First and foremost, what you want to be is a resource that people want to work with. And if you're being too pedantic and too absolutist, you're going to end up turning people off rather than engaging them. So I think it's better to err a little bit on the side of allowing folks maybe to do things in a way that you might not, but being supportive, being there for them, and then ultimately creating the opportunity to steer them towards the right projects, steer them towards perhaps more rigorous ways of doing things. So I hope those those ideas and what I've shared today is helpful to you. What I'd love to just end with is an invitation. I realize today has necessarily been one way with me speaking, but I'd love to hear from many of you, hear your challenges, hear what you're thinking about. And you can reach out to me at that email address, scottyoung@bessie.org. I'd also encourage you to go to Bessie, which is a nonprofit that's focused on growing the field, and you'll find many more resources there. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and in fact, you can find these articles and many others through my LinkedIn account. And if you don't see something you're looking for, or if you have a specific question, again, you can certainly reach right out to me, and I'd be happy to jump on a call or at the very least point you in the right direction. So I'll end it there. Thank you, and I wish you all a great conference, and more importantly, continued success in your behavioral science journeys. So thanks again, everyone. Take care, and I hope to see you in person next year.